The auditorium held 600 people, and every one of them was standing. I know because I counted. Not deliberately. It was the kind of thing my brain did automatically, the same way it counted lines of code and tracked variable states, and noticed when something was off by exactly one. 600 people on their feet, applauding, and the sound of it filled the hall in a way that should have felt triumphant. It felt like something being stolen. My brother walked onto the stage from the left wing, the way people walk when they have been told where to enter and have practiced it. He wore a dark suit and his best expression, the one he'd had since childhood, open and slightly surprised, as if success kept finding him rather than the other way around. The cameras moved toward him. The reporters leaned forward. A woman near the front was crying, which seemed excessive for a technology award, but told me something about how effectively the story had been packaged. Behind him, on the demonstration screen, the system came to life. The interface, the architecture diagram, the core framework laid out in the particular visual language I had spent 3 years developing because the standard representations didn't capture what the system actually did. I sat in the back row and looked at my own work on a screen 40 feet wide and felt something I didn't have a precise word for. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. The specific sensation of a person who has been carefully erased from a picture they spent years painting. The presenter said my brother's name. The audience applauded again. I looked at the screen. Every line of it was mine. Let me tell you about the 4 years before that night. Not because I want sympathy, or not only because of that. Because the magnitude of what was taken is impossible to understand without understanding what it cost to build. And what it cost was, essentially, everything else. I was 26 when the idea fully formed. I'd been working at a mid-sized software firm in Seattle, doing the kind of solid, unremarkable work that pays well and leaves no particular trace on the world. I was good at it. I was good at most technical things I applied myself to, which had been true since I was 9 years old, and had the particular blessing and curse of a mind that found patterns quickly and got bored just as fast. The problem I wanted to solve was not new. Researchers had been working on it for years. The question of how to build an AI architecture that could adapt its own learning processes in real time rather than requiring the massive retraining cycles that made existing systems expensive and inflexible. The approaches I'd read were clever. None of them worked well enough. I thought I could see why. I started writing, at first in notebooks and then in code, the framework for something different, a system that treated its own optimization, parameters as dynamic variables rather than fixed weights, that could essentially rewrite portions of its own operational logic based on performance feedback without losing coherence. It sounds technical because it is technical. What it meant, practically, was a system that could learn the way people learn, not in discrete training sessions, but continuously, in real time, getting better at the specific things it needed to be better at as it encountered them. I called it the kernel. I did not tell anyone what I was building for the first year. The 4 years looked like this from the outside. A man in his late 20s who worked his regular job during the day and disappeared into his apartment every evening and most of both weekend days, who declined invitations with a frequency that eventually stopped generating invitations, who kept a coffee maker on his desk and a notepad beside his keyboard and spent more time alone than was probably healthy, but who could not stop, because the work was at a stage where stopping would mean losing the thread, and losing the thread was not something he was willing to do. From the inside, it felt like the opposite of isolation. When you are building something that hasn't existed before, you are never entirely alone. You are in constant conversation with the problem, which talks back in the form of results. What works? What doesn't? Where the logic has a gap you didn't anticipate. It is exhausting and consuming and entirely absorbing in a way that ordinary work rarely is. I missed things. I know I missed things. I missed a relationship that ended partly because she said I was only half present even when I was physically in the room. I missed a friend's wedding because I was 3 days away from a breakthrough I couldn't abandon. I missed, in the aggregate, most of my 20s in the conventional sense, the social architecture of that decade, the building of the kind of life that runs parallel to work rather than being consumed by it. I told myself there would be time for that later. I have since revised that assumption. My brother Marcus was 3 years younger than me, which meant he had grown up in the particular position of a child who arrives after the family has already organized itself around someone else's characteristics and must therefore develop his own. I was quiet, technical, better with systems than with people. Marcus was the opposite, fluent in rooms, easy with strangers, the kind of person who made everyone feel slightly more comfortable simply by being present. He had our mother's gift for reading what a situation required and providing it, which is a social intelligence distinct from other kinds and extremely useful in certain contexts. He was also, by 30, moderately successful in tech in the way that charming people who are somewhat good at things can be successful, well-liked, networked, employed by a company that valued his ability to communicate technical concepts to non-technical stakeholders. Not a builder, a translator. My parents were proud of both of us, in the way parents are proud of both of their children when one of them is easier to be proud of in public. I don't say that with bitterness, though I understand it sounds like bitterness. I say it because it was true and because it is necessary context. My parents loved me. They also found Marcus more legible. He gave them things they could point to: the presentation, the award, the photo at the company event. I gave them things they couldn't explain to their friends. They had always, in the gentle and well-intentioned way of people who believe they are helping, been more comfortable with Marcus's version of success than with mine. I told them about the project when it was 2 years in, and I had enough to show that it wasn't theoretical. My father looked at the diagrams I brought to Sunday dinner and said it was impressive, which was his word for things he didn't fully understand but could tell were significant. My mother asked how long it would take, and I said I didn't know. She said Marcus might be able to help with the presentation side when the time came. I said I'd think about it. The time came 1.5 years later. I had reached a stage where the core architecture was complete, but the documentation was lagging. The technical writing that would make the system legible to researchers and review committees. The material that would accompany a formal submission to the National Institute for AI Research. It was not my strongest area. I was good at building the thing. I was less good at explaining the thing to people who hadn't spent 4 years living inside it. My father called on a Tuesday evening. He said Marcus had been asking about the project. He said Marcus had some experience with research proposals from his work. He said he thought it might be worth getting Marcus involved, not in the technical side, just the communication side, the framing, the way the proposal was presented. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. The submission deadline was 6 weeks out. I called Marcus. He was enthusiastic in the way he was enthusiastic about most things, warm, engaged, asking questions that showed he had been thinking about it since our father mentioned it. He said he was honored to help. He said the work sounded remarkable. He said he just wanted to support what I'd built. I believed him. That was the mistake, though I don't know that I would make a different decision with the same information. I invited him to collaborate on the documentation. I created a shared repository. I typed the command that gave him access. I hit enter. The cursor blinked. I didn't know enough yet to understand what I had just done. Marcus was a good collaborator on the surface. That is the thing I keep coming back to, even now, how nothing about the 6 weeks felt wrong while it was happening. He showed up when he said he would. He asked questions. He took notes. He produced drafts of the documentation sections I gave him, and the drafts were competent, cleaner than I expected, with a clarity of language that made the technical concepts accessible without distorting them. I told my mother he was doing well. She said she knew he would. There were moments, small ones, the kind I assigned meaning to only in retrospect, where his questions went slightly beyond what documentation required. He asked twice about the kernel specifically, not in a way that seemed inappropriate, in the way of someone trying to understand what he was describing. He asked how it interfaced with the outer architecture. He asked whether it could function independently of the larger system. I explained. I showed him the relevant sections of the code base. I remember thinking he was more curious than I expected. I remember thinking that was a good sign. We submitted on a Thursday in March. I sent the files at 11:17 in the evening, which I know because I still have the sent confirmation in my email, time-stamped. The way digital things preserve themselves with an indifference to what they might eventually be used to prove. The submission package was substantial. The technical paper, the architecture documentation, a working demonstration of the system's core capabilities. Letters of context from 2 researchers I had connected with over the years who understood what I was attempting. The National Institute for AI Research ran a competitive annual review. Acceptance meant funding, recognition, and the kind of institutional legitimacy that turns a private project into a public contribution. I had been working toward this for 4 years. I hit send and sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time afterward, not celebrating. I'm not someone who celebrates before outcomes are known, but sitting with the specific stillness of a person who has done the thing they set out to do and is now waiting to find out what it was worth. Marcus texted at midnight, "Good luck. You built something real." I said thank you. I meant it. The rejection came 8 weeks later. It arrived in the form of an email with the Institute's letterhead, formal, brief, the language of an organization that sends many of these and has learned to make them neither cruel nor encouraging. The panel had reviewed the submission. The work showed promise. At this time, they were unable to move forward with funding consideration. They wished me well with future submissions. I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk that lasted 2 hours, through the neighborhood and down to the waterfront and back. And by the time I got home, it was raining and I was wet, and I had not arrived at any particular conclusion, except that 4 years was a long time to spend on something that showed promise. I did not call Marcus. I did not call my parents. I told no one for 4 days, which was the amount of time it took to move through the initial phase of it and arrive somewhere I could speak from without my voice doing something I didn't want it to do. When I told my parents, my mother said she was sorry, and my father said sometimes, these things take multiple submissions, and Marcus said, in a text that arrived an hour after I'd spoken to my parents, which in retrospect tells me something about the speed of their communication, that the panel didn't know what they were looking at, and that I shouldn't give up. I said thanks. I meant it less this time. The month after the rejection was the worst month of the 4 years, worse than the difficult stretches during the work itself, because during those stretches I at least had the work. The month after, I had the absence of it. The project was complete, the submission was made, the outcome was settled, and what remained was the hollow space where the purpose had been. I went to work. I came home. I sat in front of the codebase some evenings and looked at it without opening files. The self-doubt that arrived during that month was a particular variety, not the generative doubt of someone in the middle of a problem who isn't sure of their approach, but the retrospective kind. The kind that says, maybe it wasn't as good as you thought. Maybe 4 years of living inside something made you unable to see its limitations. Maybe the panel was right, and you were too close to understand what you were actually looking at. This kind of doubt is difficult to argue with because it has the texture of humility. It is often, in my experience, wrong. I didn't know that yet. I sat with it for a month and let it do its work on me and told myself I would figure out what came next when I had the energy to figure out what came next. The headline appeared on a Tuesday morning. I was eating breakfast. I had my laptop open to the news, a habit from years of scanning the tech press as part of keeping up with the field, and I was not paying close attention. The way you don't pay close attention to things in the first half hour of the morning before the day has properly started. The headline was large. Walker AI Framework poised to revolutionize machine learning. National Institute announces major breakthrough. I looked at it. I set down my coffee. I read the headline again. Walker was my last name. Walker was also Marcus's last name. I clicked the link. The article was long and well written in the way that science journalism is well written. When something genuinely significant has occurred, accessible, enthusiastic, careful with the technical details in the way that suggests the writer had consulted someone who understood them. There were quotes from researchers. There were quotes from the Institute. There was a photograph. Marcus was in the photograph. He was standing in front of a demonstration screen. The demonstration screen showed the system interface, the visual layout I had designed over 3 months of iteration, the particular arrangement of the architecture diagram that represented the way I thought about the system's structure, which was not the conventional representation, and which I had never seen anywhere else because I had invented it. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I scrolled down to the embedded video. The video was a presentation, Marcus at a podium, the Institute's logo behind him, an audience of what looked like researchers and press. He was explaining the system. His voice was confident and clear, the translator's gift for making the complex feel accessible, and the explanation was good, technically accurate, appropriately precise. It was my explanation, not paraphrased, not adapted. The specific language I had developed over 4 years of thinking about how to describe what the system did. The analogies I had arrived at through trial and error. The particular framing of the kernel's function that I had written in my documentation and refined, and considered the clearest way to express something that was genuinely difficult to express, coming out of my brother's mouth, in front of an audience that was nodding. I watched the video to the end. Then I watched it again. Then I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, and looked at the wall, and felt the pieces of the previous 8 weeks rearrange themselves into a shape that made a different kind of sense than the shape they'd been in before. The rejection, the timing, the questions Marcus had asked about the kernel specifically, the text at midnight, "You built something real." I sat with the new shape of it. I did not move for a long time. Then I opened my laptop, and I started looking. The Git repository told the story more clearly than anything else. Version control is, among other things, a confession system. Every change is logged with a timestamp and an author. Every file modification, every addition, every deletion, recorded, dated, attributed. The history of a code base is the history of the decisions that built it, and that history does not revise itself to protect anyone. I pulled up the repository I had shared with Marcus 6 weeks before the submission. His access had started on a Tuesday. By the following Sunday, he had cloned the entire codebase, not the documentation folder, not the sections I had given him to work on. Everything, the full architecture, the optimization models, the interface code, the kernel module, which I had not given him explicit direction to access because it was the core of the system and not something that required documentation in the conventional sense. It required understanding, which I had assumed he didn't need because he was supposed to be working on presentation. He had cloned it at 2:14 in the morning on a Sunday. I sat with that timestamp for a while. 2:14 in the morning, not a casual exploration, a decision. The metadata on the Institute's public announcement told me more. The submission that had been accepted, Marcus's submission, the one attached to his name and his affiliation, had a filing date of 2 weeks after my rejection. 2 weeks. The review cycle for the Institute's competitive track ran 6 months. An acceptance 2 weeks after my rejection meant one of two things. Either Marcus's submission had been in the review process simultaneously with mine, or it had been fast-tracked through a process that did not apply to standard submissions. I knew which one it was. I just needed to find the mechanism. I found it in an email I was not supposed to see. My parents' email system was something I had set up for them 8 years earlier, when they had moved to a new provider and needed help with the migration. In doing so, I had configured a backup address, an administrative account, intended for account recovery, that routed copies of certain system notifications to a secondary inbox I had access to and had forgotten about completely. I had never looked at it. I looked at it now. What I found was not the full correspondence. It was fragments of system notifications, auto-forwarded confirmations, the digital residue of email threads that had been conducted through the backup path for reasons I didn't fully understand and didn't need to. It was enough. There was a message from my father to a name I recognized, Dr. Harmon, a senior research director at the Institute, whose work I had cited in my own proposal, whom I had attempted to contact directly 6 months earlier through official channels and received no response from. My father had apparently not had that problem. The message was brief. It referenced Marcus by name. It referenced the research. It said something about a conversation they'd had at an event, a fundraising dinner, the kind my father attended occasionally through his professional network, the kind I had never thought of as relevant to anything in my life. The date was 3 weeks before I submitted my proposal. 3 weeks before I submitted, my father had already been in contact with the Institute about my research, with my brother's name attached to it. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk and assembled what I had into a document, the Git logs, the timestamps, the metadata, the email fragments, and I looked at what it added up to, which was a scheme that had not been improvised in a moment of opportunism, but planned over weeks by people who had known what I was building and had decided, before I even submitted what would happen to it. The rejection had not been a rejection. It had been a reroute. My proposal, reviewed by a panel that included at least one person my father had spoken to beforehand, had been declined not because it was insufficient, but because the plan required it to be declined. The work would be resubmitted through Marcus, with Marcus's name, through connections that had been cultivated specifically for this purpose. I had spent 4 years building something. My parents had spent 3 weeks arranging for someone else to own it. I called my mother the next morning. I told her what I had found. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to tell me she was not going to deny it. What she said after the silence was, "You have to understand, Ethan. Marcus is better positioned for this." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "He can handle the public side, the attention, the presentations. You've always hated that kind of thing." I said, "It was my work." She said, "And it's going to reach more people this way. Isn't that what matters? The work reaching people?" I did not answer, not because I had nothing to say, because I was looking at something else. A memory, then another, then several more arriving in rapid succession. The way memories arrive when the frame you've been using to interpret them suddenly shifts. My junior year science fair project. Age 16. A computational model for predicting local weather patterns using machine learning. Early, rough, but real. The kind of thing a 16-year-old builds when they have been teaching themselves to code since they were 12. I had shown it to Marcus, who was 13, who had been curious and asked questions the way he always asked questions, warm and engaged. Marcus had submitted a version of the same model to his school's science competition 2 years later. He had won first place. I had thought it was a coincidence. A similar idea arrived at independently. It happened, my sophomore year of college. A paper I wrote on distributed systems optimization that my professor had encouraged me to submit to an undergraduate research journal. I had shown a draft to my parents, who had asked if they could share it with Marcus, who was interested in the topic. The paper had been submitted under Marcus's name, a version of it, revised, to a different journal. 6 months before my own submission, he had received a commendation. I had wondered, briefly, how he'd developed the idea so fully without my knowing. I had not wondered long enough. There were others. A programming competition in high school, where Marcus had placed well, with a solution I recognized as a simplified version of something I had shown him. A university project that had earned him department recognition. A presentation he had given at a company event that had used a framework I had described to him over dinner 2 years before. Small things, none of them, individually, rising to the level of accusation. All of them together a pattern. I sat at my desk and looked at the pattern and understood that the AI project was not an aberration. It was a culmination. My parents had been managing this for over 20 years, quietly, without ever stating it explicitly, operating from the belief that Marcus was better suited to visibility, and I was better suited to invisibility and arranging things accordingly. Taking what I built, giving it to him, watching him succeed with it, and interpreting their own role in this as support, as helping, as doing what was best for the family. I thought about 20 years of that. I did not call them back. There was one more thing. In the planning, and I could see now that it had been careful planning, more careful than I had initially understood, there was a gap. The kernel, the core optimization engine that made the system actually work, that was the difference between a promising architecture and a functional one. I had never fully committed it to the shared repository, not deliberately, not as protection. It simply had not been part of the documentation process, because the kernel was not something you documented for a general audience. It was the deep internal logic of the system, the part that required the most explanation and the most context. And I had been planning to address it in the technical appendix that I never finished because the submission had a deadline and the outer documentation was more immediately necessary. Marcus had cloned the repository at 2:14 in the morning. He had taken everything that was there. He had not taken what wasn't there. The kernel existed in one place, my local machine, backed up to a private drive I owned, not in the cloud, not in the shared repository, not anywhere that a cloned codebase would reach. He had stolen the house. He had left the foundation behind. And now the house was on television. The first public demonstration was scheduled for a Thursday. The Institute had arranged it as a showcase, live demonstration of the system's capabilities, researchers in attendance, press coverage. The kind of event designed to announce that something real had arrived. I watched the live stream from my apartment. The system initialized correctly. The interface loaded. Marcus narrated from the podium, smooth and confident, explaining the architecture in language that was mine, describing capabilities that were real, walking the audience through what the system could do. Then the first adaptive test sequence began, the one that required the kernel. The loading indicator ran for several seconds longer than it should have, then longer still. Then the system returned an error I recognized immediately, a null reference from the optimization module, the specific error that occurred when the kernel module was called and not found. On a live stream, in front of 300 researchers and a dozen journalists, Marcus's face did not change in the way that experienced presenters' faces don't change when something goes wrong, a professional blankness, a smooth pivot to saying they would address the technical issue and continue with the demonstration. But the researchers in the audience were not watching his face. They were watching the screen. And on the screen, the system that had been announced as the most significant AI breakthrough of the decade was sitting at an error prompt, waiting for something it didn't have, something that was still sitting on a hard drive in my apartment, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. The error stayed on the screen for 11 seconds. I know because the live stream was recorded, and I have watched that 11 seconds many times since, not out of satisfaction, or not only out of satisfaction, but because there is something instructive about watching the exact moment a carefully constructed illusion reaches the limit of what illusion can sustain. 11 seconds of a loading indicator that was not loading. Then the error message. Then Marcus's face, doing the thing professional faces do. Then the audience doing the thing audiences do when they are researchers, and something does not add up. A particular quality of stillness. The collective recalibration of people who are trained to notice discrepancies. The demonstration continued with the features that didn't require the kernel. They were real features. They worked, but the researchers in that room had come to see the adaptive learning system specifically, the capability that had been announced as the breakthrough, the thing that separated this architecture from everything that already existed. That was the thing that hadn't worked. By the following morning, there were 17 posts on research forums asking the same question in different ways. Why did the optimization module fail? The questions compounded over the next 2 weeks. A researcher at MIT published a brief technical analysis, noting that the system as demonstrated did not appear to exhibit the adaptive capabilities described in the published documentation. 3 other researchers replied with similar observations. A journalist at a technology publication filed a request with the Institute for access to the full technical specification. The Institute, which had staked significant credibility on the announcement, responded by commissioning an independent technical review panel. 5 researchers, no institute affiliation, access to all submitted materials. They asked for the complete source code. Marcus provided what he had. The panel spent 4 days with it. On the 5th day, they sent the institute a report. I know what the report said because it was eventually made public, as these things are when they become part of a formal record. What it said, in the careful language of people who are stating serious things and want to be precise, was that the submitted codebase appeared to be missing critical components necessary for the functionality described in the documentation. The optimization module referenced a kernel-level process that did not exist in the provided code. Without this component, the system's claimed adaptive capabilities could not be reproduced. They also noted something about the Git history. Specifically, they noted that the authorship metadata on the majority of the codebase showed a single primary contributor. That contributor's username was not Marcus's. It was mine. The panel requested an interview with Marcus. I heard about this secondhand through a researcher I knew peripherally who was connected to someone on the panel. What I heard was that the interview lasted 3 hours, and that Marcus had answered the general questions competently. The architectural overview, the high-level design decisions, the things that could be learned from documentation and presentation, and had struggled with the specific ones. The specific ones were the kind that only the person who built something could answer. Why this approach rather than that one? What had been tried and failed before arriving at the current solution? how the optimization parameters interacted at the level below, what was visible in the interface. These were not trick questions. They were the natural questions of people who wanted to understand a system deeply enough to evaluate it. And they had answers. I knew their answers precisely, could have spoken for hours on each one, but the answers lived in the experience of building the thing. And that experience was mine. And it was not transferable through documentation or preparation, or the kind of intelligent, charming translation that Marcus had always been good at. He could explain the house. He couldn't explain why the foundation was built the way it was. Because he hadn't built it, the emails became public in the third week. Not through me. I had the fragments I'd found through the backup account, but I had not released them, had been holding them, not sure yet what to do, aware that what I did and how I did it would define how this story ended for everyone involved. They became public because the panel, in the course of its review, had subpoenaed the Institute's communication records. And in those records were the emails, not fragments but the full thread, my father's initial contact with Dr. Harmon, the subsequent conversation about the submission, the arrangement that had been made before I had filed anything. The thread made clear that my father had contacted the Institute with the explicit purpose of routing a research submission under Marcus's name. That doctor, Harmon, who had been a family acquaintance for years through channels I had never known about, had agreed to facilitate the review in a way that ensured a particular outcome, that my rejection had been coordinated. The Institute suspended Dr. Harmon pending investigation. The story moved from the research forums to the general technology press. By the end of the week, it was in publications that my parents' neighbors read. My mother called on a Saturday morning. I looked at the phone for a moment before I answered. She was crying, not dramatically, not the crying of a performance, but the quiet kind that happens when someone has been holding something for a long time and the holding is no longer possible. She said she was sorry. She said they hadn't meant for it to go this far. She said they had thought they were helping. I said, I know you thought that. She said, Marcus's, it's very bad, Ethan. His career. I said, yes. If you came forward, she said. If you explained that you were involved, that it was collaborative, it would change how people. Mom, I said. She stopped. It wasn't collaborative, I said. You know that. A silence. He's your brother, she said. I know who he is, I said. Another silence, longer. What would you have me do? I said. Tell me specifically. You want me to go in front of the people investigating this and say that I participated in something I didn't participate in. You want me to give my name to protect his. The way you gave his name to take mine. She didn't answer. I spent 4 years building that system, I said. I spent 20 years watching you give what I built to someone else. I am not going to spend whatever comes next cleaning up the consequences of that. My voice was level. I had not raised it. This was, I think, the thing that got through, not the words but the flatness of them, the absence of the anger she might have been able to argue with. She said, I love you, I hope you know that. I said, I know. I said, that's what makes it hard. I ended the call. I sat in my apartment in the quiet. Outside, the city did what cities do. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something more complicated and less satisfying than triumph, which was the feeling of a person who has been handed back something that was taken from them and is now holding it and understanding, fully, everything that was lost in the interval. The 4 years were real. They were also gone. What came next would be built on them, but it would not be them. You cannot recover time. You can only decide what to do with the time that remains. I opened my laptop. I wrote an email to the review panel. I told them I was the original author of the research. I told them I had the kernel. I told them I was prepared to provide full documentation, version history, and technical testimony. I attached the first 50 pages of my original development notes, time-stamped, authored, unambiguous. I hit send. Then I opened the kernel codebase, and I started working. 3 years is enough time to build something properly. Not rushed, not toward a deadline someone else controlled, not in the margins of a life organized around other people's needs and other people's timelines. 3 years at the pace of someone who has learned, at some cost, that the pace matters, that the difference between work done under pressure and work done with patience is visible in the result, and that the result is the only thing that lasts. The system I built in those 3 years was better than the one Marcus had presented, not incrementally, Fundamentally, the kind of better that happens when you take what you know and add to it 3 years of focused development and the specific clarity that comes from understanding, precisely, where an earlier version fell short. I filed 17 patents. I was deposed twice in the Institute investigation and testified once before a formal review board. The process was not pleasant. It was also not difficult, in the way that telling the truth about things you built yourself is not difficult. The details are simply there, available, because they live in the experience of having made them, and no amount of preparation can replicate that in someone who didn't. Marcus's name was removed from the published research. He was asked to return the award. He left the industry. I don't know where he went. We have not spoken. My parents I speak to occasionally, carefully, with the particular care of people navigating a relationship that has been fundamentally altered and is not going to return to what it was, but which neither party is ready to formally end. My mother asks about the work. My father asks about the work. They do not ask about Marcus. I do not ask about Marcus either. The invitation to the International Symposium arrived in January, the Global Innovation in AI Research Award, given annually by a consortium of research institutions across 11 countries, to work that represented a genuine advance in the field. The ceremony was in Amsterdam. The auditorium held 400 people. I stood in the left wing and listened to the applause and thought, briefly, of another auditorium, the one I had sat in the back row of, watching my brother walk out from the left wing in a dark suit with his best expression. The presenter said my name. I walked out. The lights were bright in the way stage lights are bright, flattening distance, making the audience a general mass of presence rather than individual faces. I walked to the podium and looked at the screen behind me, where the system architecture was displayed, my visual language, my framework, the particular representation I had developed because the standard ones didn't capture what the system actually did. The presenter handed me the award. The audience applauded. I looked at the screen. At the bottom of the architecture diagram, in the presentation template the symposium team had built from my materials, was the attribution line. Ethan Walker. The name on the screen was correct. Not my brother's. Mine. I had spent 4 years building something real. It had taken 3 more to make sure the right person was standing in front of it. 7 years is a long time. It is also, I have found,